Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Before we start, I just want to say I'm sorry for not posting for a while. It's been super busy. But today we're going to be talking about the difference between mice and rats and also the difference between feeding live and frozen thawed. So I hope you enjoy it. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is the difference between mice and rats. Now, a lot of times when you go and you first buy your snake, especially if it isn't from a breeder and it's from a pet store, they will have the snake eating mice. Now, a lot of snakes prefer eating mice, especially when they're younger, because it's just more natural for them, I guess. However, it's not as healthy. Rats tend to have a much higher protein content than mice do, and mice tend to be a lot more fatty. So all my snakes are on rats except for the baby, and he is currently on mice still, but he is being switched over to rats. I did have a snake that was, well, it was Longspot, and when he was young, I kept him on feeding him mice because that's just what I knew to do. And they were proper sized mice. However, he was not gaining weight, and he was only 324 grams or so at 2 years of age, which is very small for a ball python. I switched him over to rats, and he immediately started gaining weight, and he is now a proper size for his age. But that's just one thing you want to be careful of. There's a lot of controversy on that subject because there's also many other types of rodents you can feed your snakes other than mice and rats. But with ball pythons, rats are typically the best to go. There's others that you want to keep them on mice, but rats are the way to go for ball pythons. This is a little bit of a different subject, but if your ball python is not eating and is having a hard time, you can also try Asian soft furs. And ball pythons love those. It's like their natural food, and they tend to take it immediately. I had to put Noodle back quickly. She was getting a little too active. But now with me, I have Fuller. So for those of you who are wondering, he's doing great. He's eaten like 3 meals, I believe. And he's also shed. He just shed about 3 days ago. So he's doing great. I will be doing an update video on him pretty soon, but I was going to give him a little more time since it hasn't been too long. Now we're going to talk about the pros and cons of feeding live or frozen thawed. This is kind of a hard thing for me because I do both, and it really depends on your snake. A lot of ball pythons especially will not eat frozen thawed, and that is the case for 2 of my snakes. It was 3, however, he will now eat frozen thawed for me, which is really great. We're going to start with the cons of feeding live, and that is that your snakes can get hurt, and I think that that's the biggest thing. As you see up here, my Noodle has gotten hurt a few times. Another thing that can be kind of hard is that when you're feeding live, at least in my experience, my snakes have become a bit more aggressive, especially when I come around. They're almost thinking, oh, it's moving, is it food? Which in the case of feeding frozen thawed, I have not seen that as much. They seem to be very like, okay, this is food, it doesn't really move, and you're not food. And the only other con, at least for me, is that you do have to go and buy the live rats more often than if you were just doing frozen thawed. Like, you'd have to go every week or 2. Otherwise, you'd have to just keep a bunch of rats, I guess, in your house until it was time to feed them. With a frozen thawed, though, you can just keep them in your freezer. I mean, I can keep hundreds of mice or rats in my freezer at a time, and nothing will happen. And they don't go bad or anything. I mean, it takes years. Okay, so the only pros that I can think of for feeding live, other than the fact that if you don't have frozen rats or mice on hand and live are available to you, then of course it would be the easiest, is that a lot of times if you have a picky ball python or a picky snake in general, they will take live better than they'll take frozen thawed. And I've experienced that with many of my snakes, where if I'm trying to get them back on food and they've eaten frozen thawed before, I'll give them a live mouse. That'll get them back on the food schedule, and then I can switch them back over to frozen thawed. The one other thing that I have heard from people, which I don't honestly think matters so much, is that it keeps their instincts, because in the wild they catch live rats or mice, but they're not going to be back in the wild. They're in captivity. They're never going to be put in the wild, at least they shouldn't be, so it probably doesn't matter at all. Okay, so moving on to the cons of feeding frozen thawed, there's really only like one main con that I can think of, and that is if you do have a picky snake, a lot of times they will not eat frozen thawed and they will eat live. So that's really the one thing. The other thing is that it's a possibility that it's not as healthy for the snake since it's been frozen, but it really isn't that likely. So I think that overall they're pretty safe. It's just if you can get your snake to eat them or not. The pros of frozen thawed, I mean, I think that there's a lot of them. Less aggression, I think, during feeding time. Your snake obviously won't get hurt. It's not like the dead rat could do anything to it. It's also just easier because you can keep them in your freezer, like I said, for long periods of time and not have to be going out every week just to get some food for your snake. So, I mean, those are the main things. It's really up to you to decide what you think is best for your snake or what your snake will eat. But overall, if you weigh them, I think that frozen thawed is a bit better, but there's other people who have opinions that are live are better, and I'm sure they have reasons too. So just look into that and decide what's best for you and your snake depending on that. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do today is I'm going to be revealing her name. So a lot of my animals have like names along the line of food. So I have my gecko, who is Caramel, and then my brother's birds, who are Blueberry and Kiwi, and we also have a few other animals like Noodle, my snake, and they all have food names. So I have decided to name her Mocha. I think that goes well with her colors, that name does, and kind of her personality as well. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please leave any comments or questions down below and I'll answer. And also make sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss any future videos.